Go, everyone.
Are we ready?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of Learning and Mending. I'm Jen, and as we are all signing in, I'm going to share with you the embroidery of the week. And this week's embroidery was created by Michelle Glass, and I have to tell you, I've fallen in love with it. I think it's so cool on so many levels. For starters, I love the colors. I love the outline, and it just has so much dimensionality to it. Even though the bird is not fully colored in, I find it so charming. And then I really love the technique of just coloring in with a marker that looks like the name of the bird and the plant. So this is our embroidery of the week, and now we'll do a couple minutes of popcorning on your, introducing yourself, what you're working on. Again, I'm Jen. I'm calling in from Studio City. I use she/her pronouns, and tonight I am going to continue my bird pattern, which I think I'm gonna fill it in. I think I'm gonna go the route that Olan did and just keep going. So this is my bird, and I am going to pass it to Walker.
Hi, everyone. I'm calling from California, Cummins, and I'm working on this little microbial business thing going on. Not sure exactly what it is. It's becoming something. And I'm gonna pass it on to Marianne.
Hello, I'm Marianne. I'm in Silver Lake, and this is mine. I'm working on, I don't know how close I can get there. I'm currently really kind of in love with my little river there that I created in the, not sure what that part is. That was also inspired by Olan's thicker stitching.
It's beautiful.
Working on it. Great to be here. How about you, Olan?
Yes, hi. Nice to see you, Marianne, and everybody. I'm in West Hollywood. I use she, her pronouns. I've almost finished this thing of the million stitches, the many million stitches.
Wow, wow, wow.
Wow.
And I'll pass it on to Izzy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Izzy. I'm calling from East Hollywood. My pronouns are they, she. Tonight, I'm working on the same mycelium embroidery I've been working on slowly. And I will pass it on to Dee Rayner.
Hi, Derainer, calling in from Baldwin Hills. I go by she, her pronoun, and I am working on this underground pattern. I have a long way to go. So I'm going to be very busy tonight. And I'm happy to be here joining in and excited about the reading tonight. And I will pass it on to Kavi.
Good evening, everyone. Happy Diwali. Calling in from Sacramento. My pronouns are he, him, and they, and I'll be sharing the screen tonight and looking forward to being in conversation with you all. We'll pass it over to Kate.
Hi, I'm Kate, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm calling in from Pasadena, and I'm working on white sage. And I came a little late, so I'm not sure who's all gone. So I'll try passing it on to Vicky. Have you gone?
Thank you. I'm in Santa Monica, California. I use she, her pronouns, and behind me is a picture of me in my shelter bug Halloween mask. And I'm not currently working on one from the studio. A friend of mine from Piece by Piece, from an independent contractor, had given me an embroidery to finish a while ago. So I'm going to be working on that. And let's see. Linda, have you gone?
Hi, I'm Linda. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm calling in from Los Altos in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I haven't made very much progress, but I'm working on this mycelium carbon network exchange and looking forward to making more progress on it. And I will pass this along to Stefano or Stefano. I don't know how you pronounce.
Yeah, you said it right the first time. Hi, I'm Stefano, and I'm here in El Sereno, and looking forward to this episode. And I'll pass it to my friend Emily. Is she still there? Oh, yeah.
Hi everyone, Emily here, she, her pronouns in Echo Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. I am looking forward to listening tonight and creating some sonic meditations for us to enjoy, and very happy to be here with you all. Kavi, have you gone? You have. Okay, let me pass it to Caroline.
Good evening. Hello, Caroline, calling from Studio City, Tongva, Gabrielino, Chumash land, Keys Nation land, she, her pronoun. And I will start working on something Jen gave me, a bat, the bat. Yeah, we'll see where the journey goes with that. And so looking forward to hear tonight's reading and conversation. And I'll pass it to Lauren. Lauren, did you talk already?
Good evening. I am Lauren. I go by she, they pronouns. I am driving along the Pacific Coast Highway. Very happy to be listening in tonight. And I will, when I get home, be working on the bee, which I just started, re-picked up actually. And I will pass it on to Marianne.
Hi, Lauren. Great to imagine you on the stretch of the PCH. I already went, so I will pass it on to Izzy. No, Izzy's already gone too. Kavi, did you speak? You did too. Who's left?
I'll take it at this point.
Thank you.
And if you didn't have the opportunity to introduce yourself, we can do that later on this evening and share what we're working on. As I mentioned before, this is the 4th week. In this series, Tending the Commons, we will be exploring how the commons can be an alternative approach to the destructive nature of capitalism, where individual and short-term gains have been prioritized over the common and long-term good. We will be asking questions like, what are the commons, and what does this look like? How do social relations shift within the commons? In what ways do the commons resist the simulated scarcity of capitalism? This is the 6th iteration of Learning and Mending, following syllabi on abolitionist writing, indigenous perspectives of land stewardship, suffocation. Anna sings The Mushroom at the End of the World, and systems thinking. In many ways, this series is a continuation of what preceded it. We have examined alternatives to capitalism and its destructive, corrosive nature in the previous syllabi. But in this series, we are specifically looking at the alternative to capitalism, that is the commons. Many of you have received embroidery kits from us of native plants, birds, microscopic organisms that metabolic studio is currently cultivating on its project sites. Taken as a collection, all of the embroideries will collectively illustrate biogeoconosis, which describes the intimate association between living things and the physical environment. If you've not received an embroidery kit or you would like another one, please send your name and mailing address to info@metabolicstudio.org. Tonight, we will share our screen, and we encourage you to read a section of the text aloud with us. When there is a pause in the reading, please feel free to unmute yourself and begin where the last person left off. Silence is golden, and there's no pressure to fill the transitional spaces while we enjoy a breath and continue crafting. Feel free to jump in and continue reading at your comfort level. You don't have to read, it's also fine to enjoy listening. And now I will pass it over to Izzy.
Thank you, Jen. Tonight, before we get started with the reading, we're just going to do a little breath work together. So if you will, close your eyes if that's comfortable for you. And take a big, deep inhale. Pausing. And as you release, take a big collective sigh. Inviting the tension in our bodies to release. Tonight, we're reading about care, careful thinking. My hopes are that while we breathe together tonight, we intentionally attune ourselves to our bodies, sending breath and attention to parts of the body that need a little bit more care. Honoring our breath is an act of intentional care, thinking about what it means to create patterns of breath together, breathing as a kind of thinking with each other. As we take another deep inhale, breathing in our attention, let your breath deepen your relaxation. And collectively, we exhale, moving deeper into our presence in this space right now. Take another inhale, allowing your face to relax, softening the close of the eyes. Exhale, soften the tongue, the jaw. Inhale, let the crown of your head reach up toward the sky. Exhale, relax the shoulders away from the ears. Now sit here for a minute and just breathe. Letting your thoughts drift in and out of your mind, returning to the breath. Begin to wiggle your fingers and toes, opening up the eyes. And now I'll just read a little intro to the text. So Maria Puig de la Bellacasa is an associate professor in science, technology, and organization at the University of Leicester School of Management. In her text we're reading tonight, Matters of Care, Speculative Ethics in More Than Human Worlds, Puig de la Bellacasa challenges conventional anthropocentric notions of care, and she pushes back against the idea that care is an exclusively human capacity. She explores care as a more than human agency. Care does not always look the same. It's complicated and entangled, and it unfolds in many different forms across many worlds. And the radically fluid nature of care is what makes it so powerful. Care is essential for the cultivation of the commons because of its potential to move between worlds, to adapt, and to connect. And it's precisely for these reasons that Puig de la Bella Casa regards care as an ethical and political obligation. So we'll be looking at this book this week and next. This week, we'll be reading a part of the text chapter titled Thinking with Care. In this chapter, she's in dialogue with Donna Haraway, who we read last week. So if you were here for last week's session, when we read Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Cthulhu Scene, we basically just focused on the notion of making kin, forming deep relations with and across non-human species and worlds. The key word being with, because for Haraway, it's only by thinking with more than human beings that we may begin to better understand and navigate our current planetary crisis. And in the text we're reading for tonight, thinking with is an integral part of caring with for Puig de la Bella Casa. And if you didn't join us last week, that's okay. If you have any questions, you can just ask. This text stands on its own, so we will be having a conversation that's grown out of that, but is a conversation of its own. And briefly about the book, it's divided in two parts. The first is called Knowledge Politics, and the second is called Speculative Ethics in Anti-Ecological Times. The first of the book's two parts defines the motivations for expanding the ethical political meanings of care. So tonight we'll be reading from the first part in order to build just a foundational understanding of what care means in the content of this text before we move on to the second part next week, as we take a journey into the world of soil and its collective, multiplicitous rhythms and timescales. And I will say that these 2 weeks, the reading has a very different tone and energy, even though it's from the same book. They're stylistically diverse. The first one is more conversation with theorists such as Haraway. And then the next week, we'll mainly be reading about the life of the soil. So I'm going to place the glossary in the chat again tonight. If you have any questions regarding the terms, feel free to ask. This text this week is a little bit more theory driven than next. So just, if you have any questions, I'm sure we all will. I invite you to ask them. Thanks, everyone.
This week's text is broken into two sections. One brief, I think about a page and a half from the introduction, and then a selection from the chapter 2. And once we get to the end of what we're reading tonight, you'll see a red mark that kind of denotes that. So we'll be ending from that part and picking up for the next. So I'll go ahead and start us off today. Introduction: the disruptive thought of care. Care, caring, carer. Burden words and contested words. And yet so common in everyday life, as if care was evident, beyond particular expertise or knowledge. Most of us need care, feel care, are cared for, or encounter care in one way or another. Care is omnipresent, even through the effects of its absence. Like a longing emanting from the troubles of neglect, it passes within, across, throughout things. Its lack undoes, allows unraveling. To care can feel good. It can also feel awful. It can do good. It can oppress. Its essential character to humans and countless living beings makes it all the more susceptible to convey control. But what is care? Is it an affection, a moral obligation, work, a burden, a joy, something we can care or something we can learn or practice, something we can just do? Care means all these things and different things to different people in different situations. So while ways of caring can be identified, researched, and understood concretely and empirically, care remains ambivalent in significance and ontology.
Embracing these ambivalent grounds, not without tentativeness, this book invites a speculative exploration of the significance of care for thinking and living in more than human worlds. I choose this phrasing among other existing ways of naming post-humanist constituencies, excuse me, because it speaks in one breath of non-humans and other than humans, such as things, objects, other animals, living beings, organisms, physical forces, spiritual entities, and humans. Encompassing this ontological scope is vital, as it has become indisputable, if it ever wasn't, that in times binding technosciences with nature cultures, the livelihoods and fates of so many kinds and entities on this planet are unavoidably entangled. Certainly, this term remains unsatisfying for its abstract unspecificity and for the moral undertones that invite us to transcend, quote unquote, the human for something, quote unquote, more than. It also still starts from a human center, then to reach beyond. However, it works well enough as the uncertain terrain for the delicate task of broadening consideration of the lives involved in caring agencies, still mostly thought as something that human people do. Care is a human trouble, but this does not make of care a human-only matter. Affirming the absurdity of disentangling human and non-human relations of care and the ethicalities involved requires decentering human agencies, as well as remaining close to the predicaments and inheritances of situated human doings. I feel, oh, that was the end, yes, okay. Thinking with care, reality is an active verb. Corrosive skepticism cannot be midwife to new stories. The epigraphs above disclose that this chapter unfolds as an intimate reading of Donna Haraway's relational ontology, where beings do not pre-exist their relatings, as a way of exploring how styles of thinking and writing technologies can contribute to relations of care in moving worlds. It is more particularly Haraway's take on the situatedness of knowledge that I read speculatively as a way of thinking with care. That knowledge is situated means that knowing and thinking are unconceivable without the multitude of relations that make possible the worlds we think with. The premise from which I begin this chapter is thus quite simple. Relations of thinking and knowing require care and affect how we, require care and affect how we care. In tune with a non-normative approach to care as a speculative ethics, the grounds of this premise are ontological rather than moral or epistemological. Not only relations involve care, care is relational per se. I'll let someone else pick a pack of pickled peppers.
Caring and relating share ontological resonance. Again, Toronto's generic definition of care says this as well. Care includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world, which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. This vision of care presupposes heterogeneity as an ontological ground on which everything humans relate with exists. Myriad doings, everything we do, and of ontological entities that compose a world, selves, bodies, environment. It speaks of care as a manifold range of doings needed to create, hold together, and sustain life and continue its diverseness. This also means that an understanding of human agencies as immersed in worlds made of heterogeneous but interdependent forms and processes of life and matter, to or not to care about for something, somebody, inevitably does and undoes relation. Its ontological import gives to care the peculiar significance of being a non-normative necessity. Feminist ethics of care argue that to value care is to recognize the inevitable interdependency essential to the existence of reliant and vulnerable beings. Interdependency is not a contract nor a moral idea. It is a condition. Care is therefore concomitant to the continuation of life for many living beings in more than human entanglements, not forced upon them by a moral order and not necessarily a rewarding obligation.
Of course, not all relations are caring, but very few could subsist without some care. Even when caring is not assured by the people, things that are perceptively involved in a specific form of relating, in order for them to merely subsist, somebody or something has had to be taking care somewhere or sometime. Even neglect, the biocidal absence of care, reveals it as inescapable. When care is removed, we can perceive the effects of carelessness. But if care is necessary, it is not given. Speaking of care as non-moralistic obligation denaturalizes care. For life to even be, it needs to be fostered in some way. That it requires doing something indicates not only that it is in its very nature to be about labors of mundane maintenance and repair that require agency, though, as I will argue later in this book, not necessarily intention, but that a more than human world's degree of livability, degree of as well as possible living, might well depend on the caring it manages to realize. Standing by the vital necessity of care means standing for sustainable and flourishing relations, not merely survivalist or instrumental ones. Continuing to hold together a triptych vision of care doings, practice, affectivity, ethics, politics, helps to resist to ground care as an ethico-effective everyday doing that is vital to engage with the inescapable troubles of interdependent existences. Haraway's relational ontology has been an inspiration for this journey into care. Before the theme of care appeared explicitly in her work, first, because for Haraway, knowledge and science are relational practices with important material consequences in the shaping of possible worlds. My claim that care matters in knowledge politics as contributing to the mattering of worlds is sustained by Haraway's call to pay attention to the workings and consequences of our semiotic technologies, that is, to practice and arts of fabricating meaning with signs, words, ideas, descriptions, theories. Following Katie King in recognizing the force of literary apparatuses, Haraway showed us how bodies as objects of knowledge are also material semiotic generative nodes. Another important source of inspiration are her situated politics of resistance to normativity, both moral and epistemological. These notions are particularly crucial for thinking that intervenes in the more than human worlds of technoscience and nature cultures, with their broken boundaries and imploded worlds where knowledge and ontology collapse. Reading Haraway speculatively is an inspiration for thinking with care in its transformative, non-innocent, disruptive ways.
Thinking with Haraway is thinking with many people, beings, and things. It is thinking in a populated world. Actually, we could say that for Haraway, thinking is thinking with. This singularity can also be read ontologically, quote, to be many or not to be at all, unquote. A Haraway, Hamlet could say, look at the many meanings a word such as biology can take in her work, a knot of relationships between living matters and social modes of existence, crafts, practices, and love stories, a range of situated epistemological, semiotic, technical, political, and material connections, an omnipresent discourse, an enterprise of civic education, a metaphor too, but also much more than a metaphor. Objects, bodies of contemporary biology are accounted for as instances of relatedness in the making. This insight goes hand in hand with resistance to reductionism, a constant questioning as to what makes one, a curiosity about the connected heterogeneities composing an entity, a body, a world that troubles boundaries. Quote, why should our bodies end at the skin, unquote. Haraway's thinking with thick populated worlds is an acknowledgement of multiplicity, but also an effort to actually foster multiplication to create diffraction, a politics of generating difference rather than mere reflection of sameness, and the fostering of accountability for the differences we try to make rather than maintaining a form of moderate reflexivity. The way in which Haraway writes is a semiotic technology of these agitations. Connective writing, phrasing worlds together, contributes to the generative drive. In this incessant web-making moves, ontology is continuously in the making, in the process of becoming. For Haraway, reality is an active verb. This doesn't mean that there are no boundaries or sustainabilities, but that beings do not pre-exist, they're relating. Such an affirmation also connects well to work in which, thinking with Susan Lee Starr, Haraway helped to redefine the objects of science as boundary projects. This concerns communities and collectives too. For instance, to answer the question of what makes a feminist, we would have to take into account that feminism does not pre-exist, it's relating. Ontologies and identities are affected by collective politics and positionalities that constantly have to confront and put into question the boundaries and cuts given in existing worlds, e.g., the taking for granted women. This way of thinking about creating other relations, other possibilities of existence, namely other beings, is linked to concerns for the consequences of relations. What and how we enter in relations affects position and relational ecologies. No longing here for fixed realities that could police the outcomes of encounter by confirming correspondence to pre-existing orders. A relational way of thinking, which I call here thinking with, creates new patterns out of previous multiplicities, intervening by adding layers of meaning rather than merely deconstructing or conforming to ready-made categories. Haraway's work has often reminded me of Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari's call, it's not enough to shout, viva the multiple. The multiple has to be done. The ways in which Haraway does thinking with many has led her to hold multiple ends of sometimes divergent positions, messing up with pre-existing categories. For existence at the height of hype surrounding her work, she puzzled attempts to class her as postmodern by affirming, quote, a lot of my heart lies in an old-fashioned science for the people, unquote. This resistance to conceptual enclosure is not without political purpose. Giving a fair account of many feminist discussions requires us to cut across fixed theoretical and academic divides. In Haraway's words, that Harstock, Harding, Collins, Starr, Habanami, Singh, Haraway, Sandoval, Hooks, and Butler are not supposed to agree about postmodernism's standpoints, science studies, or feminist theory, and is neither my problem nor theirs. Refusing the seduction of web disarticulation and mostly the disengagement with attempting further rearticulation, Haraway identifies the problem as, quote, as the needless yet common cost of taxonomizing everyone's positions without regard to the context of their development, or of refusing reading and overlays in order to make new patterns from previous disputes, unquote. There is a cost in dividing and opposing webs of thought that share a history. Readings of conflict positions in feminist thinking webs and Haraway's writing do not purify the stakes into clear sides. This includes fostering efforts to care for each other across conflicts rather than just reinforcing breaks and splits. But the most striking messing up with categories into which Haraway's thinking with has drawn her readers is possibly that of inciting us to enlarge our ontological and political sense of kinship and alliance, to dare an exercise of category transgression, a boundary definition that put to test the scope of humanist visions of care and thus disrupted existing articulations of concerns. This work welcomes us into a menagerie of figuraticians, a critical theoretical zoo where all inhabitants are not animals. Kinships and alliances become transformative connections, merging inherited and constructed relations. This one was never an evident gesture. It carried with it a speculative inquiry that pushed the boundaries of the acceptable. Promiscuous gatherings might provoke unease. So I have seen concerned feminists fairly irritated when Haraway suggested in her influential Cyborg Manifesto, Science, Technology, and Socialist Feminism in the late 20th century, that we connect with our machines. On the other hand, many postmodern feminists would have rather detached the celebrated cyborg from affections supposed to be essentialist, realist, second wave, spiritual, or any other term sounding misplaced in the cyber hype. Look at how the extremely quoted final sentence of her celebrated Cyborg Manifesto, I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess, has been systematically disconnected from the preceding words, informing that both figures are bound in the spiral dance, a characteristic ritual of neo-pagan activist spirituality for which the figure of the goddess is central. And yet the jointure of these worlds has crucial significance for speculatively imagining ethical relations that embraced the other than human at the heart of more than human ontologies. Daring to connect, reread, and overlay, Tom Van Doren vibrantly comments on the compatibility of pagan commitments to a dynamic animalistic world with Haraway's commitment to a dynamic world of active agency in which everything participates, everything acts in an ongoing process of world making, a process in which all of the various actors literally and physically are the world, as well as being actively involved in the process of negotiations in which the world takes the specific form that it does. Understanding of the world, which acknowledges that non-human others, many of whom are often considered to be inanimate objects, are endowed with meaning, power, and agency of their own. The cyborg is one famous example of attempts to foster relations that might create unease. Purifying out is a way of policing the possibilities of speculative care. I still remember shock commentaries at a feminist conference in the late 1990s when Haraway surprised a room's expectant audience by articulating her keynote around stories of personal care for her dog, Cayenne. Below, I will come back to how attempting to split these unruly webs of caring recalls the bifurcation of consciousness outlined in the previous chapter as the sanitization of affections from scholarly writing and allows neglecting interesting lessons that complicate the effects and responsibilities of caring in ordinary living. For now, what I'm attempting to elicit is the style of thinking with that, in challenging and rejoicing ways, renders such splits difficult to sustain.
Thinking with engagements, of which I have delineated as patterns, the politics of solidarities, across divergences, and the enlargement of the sense of kinship and alliance beyond humanity, goes together with an atypical density in Haraway's writing. Long enumerations exhibit multi-layered worlds she both describes and generates. An excess of layering might be a weak spot attached to the singular strength I am associating here to thinking with. Engaging with inherited worlds by adding layers rather than by analytical disarticulation translates in an effort to redescribe something so that it becomes thicker than it first seems. And is the predominant word of writing with, before, or either, rather. Situated, implicated, and grounded writing makes it uneasy to skim through or generalize the claims, especially when writing is deliberately plagued with obstacles to reductionism, to dissection of the webs of relatedness that compose a world. There is no single issue to follow. There is no single issue reading of Haraway because she doesn't write single issued worlds. This demands from readers an awareness of multiple heritages and an openness to follow lines of surprising connections. It requires an effort to sense how each of her stories is situated in crowded worlds. And it invites a letting go of trying to systemically control a totality. Odd effects occur for readers unfamiliar with the milieus this thinking immerses us in. Some amazed and inspired. Others can be irritated by a flow of diverse stories and notions and criticize this writing for being obscure.
What this style also invites is a thinking with committed to a collective of knowledge makers, however loose its boundaries and complex its shapes. A specific meaning of thinking with care appears here that further complicates the reaffecting of knowledge that I approached in the previous chapter, the embeddedness of thought in the worlds one cares for. In Haraway's work, this commitment is written in pretty obliviously through a lively politics of quotation that gives credit for many of the ideas, notions, or affects nourishing her thinking. Fellow researchers and students, friends, human and non-human, beings and forces, affinity activist groups, whether inside or outside academic or intellectual realms. We are often introduced to thick gatherings through a specific event, when, where, how an encounter worked for her, changed her, taught her something. To acknowledge the inscription of a singular thinker in a more than human web is not disregarding idiosyncratic and distinctive contributions to collective intelligences. On the contrary, reading these ways as those of thinking with care is to affirm the worth of a distinctive style of connected thinking and writing that troubles the predictable academic isolation of consecrated authors by the way it gathers and explicitly honors the collective webs one thinks with rather than using others thinking as a background against which to foreground one's own.
So that concludes the reading for this week. And before we move on to our discussion, I wanted to briefly kind of explore the other work of Donna Haraway's that was briefly kind of mentioned in the text Companion Species Manifesto, which is a follow-up to Cyborg Manifesto, first published in 1985. And Cyborg Manifesto was Haraway's kind of breakdown of the connection between human and animal and human and machine. And I wanted to provide a brief overview of the Companion Species Manifesto, briefly, but not fully comprehensive, with some quotes and paraphrasing of ideas. But first, I wanted to quickly start with one of those sections that Haraway often talks about in lectures when speaking about companion species. In the beginning of the writing, Haraway talks about her dog, Miss Cayenne Pepper, and this kind of relationship and description that comes out of the reading. I'll start here. One of us has a microchip injected under her neck skin for identification. The other has a photo ID, California's driver's license. One of us has a written record of her ancestors for 20 generations. One of us does not know her great-grandparents' name. One of us, product of the vast genetic mixture, is called purebred. One of us, equally product of vast mixture, is called white. Each of these names designates a racial discourse, and we both inherit their consequences in our flesh. One of us is at the cusp of flaming youthful physical achievements. The other is lusty, but over the hill. And we play a team sport called agility on the same expropriated native land where Cayenne's ancestor herded merino sheep. These sheep were imported from the already colonial pastoral economy of Australia to feed the California Gold Rush 49ers. In layers of history, layers of biology, layers of nanoculture, nature cultures, complexity is the name of our game. We are both the freedom-hungry offspring of conquest, products of white settler colonies, leaping over hurdles and crawling through the tunnels on the playing field. I'm sure our genomes are alike more than they should be. There must be some molecular record of our touch in the codes of living that will leave traces in the world. And no matter that we are each reproductively silenced females, one by age, one by surgery. Her red merle Australian shepherd's quick and lithe tongue has swabbed the tissues of my nostrils with all their eager immune receptors. And to move from the text and really get into deeper about the 90 so pages or so that Haraway writes in Companion Species, really trying to think about and investigating the biosocial history of dog-human relationality. She knows there's an explosion of publication about the relationships, but no serious research. And it's starting from the kind of the ideas that both the histories of dogs and humans have been shaped by white colonial societies as well, that we're both hungry freedom offspring of conquest, products of white settler colonials, leaping hurdles and crawling through the tunnels on the playing field, that even the dogs are here to live with, and partners are in our crime of human evolution. They are in the garden from the get-go, Willie as Coyote. And whatever else in kind of humans and dogs can illustrate is that they are largely bodied, global distributed, ecologically opportunistic, graciously social mammalian co-travelers that have written into their genomes a record of couplings and infectious exchanges to set teeth of even the most committed free trader on edge. The relationship is not especially nice, and she kind of goes into the history of the dog's-human relationship. It's full of waste, cruelty, indifference, ignorance, and loss, as well as full of joy, invention, labor, intelligence, and play. And dogs as pets have had a long history. In the Americas, dogs assisted in the hauling of hunting and herding of different people for different peoples, and for others, dogs were used as food, as a source of fleece. Dogs are also lethal guided weapons and instruments of terror in the European conquest of the Americas, as well as the imperial travels of Alexander the Great. Dogs that are trained are among the most intelligent weapons, as one dog breeder describes in the book, that tracking hounds terrorize slaves and prisoners, as well as rescued lost children and earthquake victims. In some exploring into some of the indigenous American cultures, that hunting dogs were often going through similar ritual preparations as their humans, as some cultures even buried their pets alongside themselves. And in cities and villages and rural areas all over the world, many dogs live parallel lives among humans, more or less tolerated, sometimes used, and sometimes abused. And in looking at the kind of post-Civil War era in the United States, companion animals really took another level to this after academic institutions started vet schools, and industrial pet keeping practices came to be known, and sharing of love with their domestic partners, human and non-humans. Haraway argues that companion species can be horses, dogs, cats, or a range of other beings that are willing to take the leap of biosociality of service dogs, family members, or even members in a cross-species sports. And briefly, the text also really examines how in our modern capitalist societies, we've led to many people taking on pets to find out how much care and attention they need, and then to dump them at shelters similar to a commodity, something kind of using as disposable. But there's more kind of complex nuances in terms of how looking at the whole history of how dogs and humans have kind of intertwined, and both have their fates have been intertwined in evolution. Looking at the kind of history of dogs, it shows research has shown that the divergence of dogs from wolves started as long as 150,000 years ago at the origin of the Homo sapiens. Dogs were living on the kind of the waste that humans provided, and then behaviorally and genetically, these dogs who were separated from wolves were biologically and behaviorally adapted for reduced tolerance distances, less hair trigger flight, puppy development timing, with long windows for cross-species socialization, and more confident parallel occupation of areas occupied by dangerous humans, both deliberate in terms of the active breeding of dogs and the unintended cohabitation with dogs and humans had consequences of shaping the ways that dogs and humans have appeared early. And human life has changed significantly in association with the dogs, in the ways that the humans have lived and used dogs for many different ways, as beasts of burden, or even into kind of co-worker relationships as well. And it is sort of coevolution of species has had at the same time. Even at the genetic level, human genomes contain a considerable amount of molecular record of the pathogens in their companion species, including dogs, and how organism integrates in their environmental and genetic information on all levels, from the very small to the very large, determines what they become. And we look at the kind of history of dogs from a very human-centered perspective. And Haraway really offers a way to explore this history of cohabitation from a very multi-species perspectives. That is a way that humans have actively bred dogs for their own, but in ways that dogs have naturally, through behavior and genetics, found ways to cohabitate with humans in ways where our waste or other products that we create have allowed them to thrive as well. And no matter kind of our relationships that we have with our companion animals, whether they're a working dog that has a job, and one might consider them a coworker, or where others may consider them family and love them unconditionally, what type of a relationship they're, whatever exists, there's kind of a common element of looking into the eyes of an animal and understanding them at a much deeper level that transcends verbal communication. And kind of going back to our thinking with, and being able to have conversations with our animals. I'm sure many of you kind of had with, if you have pets, to be able to really have a deeper connection with them and be able to understand each other at a deeper level, and kind of sharing lives with one another too, as we heard many have. And so I'll stop there and kind of turn it over to Izzy for the rest of our discussion.
Thank you, Kavi. I haven't read Companion Species, but that makes me want to check it out. I love that she focuses on her dog and her theory. That's something that not many theorists do, and it's really cool. But before we get into the discussion, I just want to read out some discussion questions for tonight. There were two quotes that the author, Maria Puig de la Bellacasa, quoted from Haraway that stuck out to me. The first being, reality is an active verb, and the second, beings do not pre-exist their relations. So if our existence is mediated through relationships, the relationships we're born from and into, it seems the author saying that we're in this web of relationships that continuously shape who we are. So therefore, relating is an inherent part of life and existence. And as the author, Maria Puig de la Bellacasa says, sorry, her name is such a mouthful every time. Of course, not all relations are caring, but very few could subsist without some care. So how is care essential to the web of relations? And in what way does care as a relation shape who we are as people in relation to one another? Similarly, how might care unshape or blur the boundaries of who we are, not just as people, not as humans, but as beings, also in relation to other more than human beings? So to reiterate a question posed in the text, why should our bodies end at the skin? Thinking with is a concept we explored with Haraway last week, and we discussed what it means to think with and make kin with more than human worlds. And thinking with is an acknowledgement of a relational way of thinking. As the author points out, all thinking is essentially thinking with, because there is no thinking without relations. What is the role of caring in thinking with? And if our existence, if all existence, if mediated, is mediated and developed through web of relation, thought through relationally and sustained through care, how might we understand the role of thinking and caring for each other and for more than human beings, etc., in the commons? So those are the questions for tonight. I'll put them in the chat. And I know that that text was theoretically really dense and difficult to follow for me. So I think whatever strain of thought kind of stood out from the text, whether it be the way that you personally relate to care to, whatever you got out of it, we would love to hear.
I was struck by, I think it was in the description or the setup to the text that you read, Izzy, about how caring can feel really good, but can also feel awful. And that kind of multi-sided nature of that particular feeling of care. And so I was pretty interested in that. That really resonated for me. Yeah, just that idea that care can be so many things, and that it lands with this kind of proclamation or conclusion that that's why care is so loaded. You know, what is cared about and what is not, and the ethical, political complexities of that. It's just really interesting to see a word like that we use all the time, you know, kind of unpacked on a philosophical level and on a environmental scale. It's really interesting.
Oh, thanks, Izzy, Emily, for that. It kind of jogged my thoughts too. I was thinking about how much of the text is so theoretically dense and difficult, as you were saying, and almost not as pleasurable as last week's text, which had a little more lyricism and poetry to it. But I think one of the reasons why that is that the conception of what it means to be a human being has been hijacked by the academy, and it's made us into this atomistic, individualistic, bounded entity that defies all biology. I was just at the Natural History Museum, and the thing that struck me is that we are like every other mammal. We have to have this process of birth and nurturing by primarily a mother. And the fact that the academy for so long has cornered this idea of being a human being as a mature, rational adult that just miraculously appears and that has rational thoughts, and that is the only significant thing about being human, erases that entire initial fact of our existence. And that's why she keeps needing to use the word ontological, because if you do take that being into account, you can't just have a human being who's without a long process of gestation, of bacteria feeding you in the womb, of coming out, of these bacteria cloaking you with a protective skin and mother's milk and all of that, as well as the end part of life where you're equally vulnerable. And so as a feminist scholar, I think people are right to say, how dare you categorize a human being as this fully formed, like rational, like adult being that's just making thoughts, because it's false, and it's a hypocrisy to consider what being a human is without care. And even the term, I think, care, the fact that it's so politicized is because of the way that what it means to be a human being has been reduced to this unrealistic slice of some people's lives. So in that sense, the text is a little bit of a theoretical exercise to like jostle free of that constriction, and to say that you cannot even think without the bacteria in your gut. You can't produce a rational thought separate from the entire biological regime in your body, which is 90% bacteria. It's not even human cells. And as well, the fact is that if a human being was alone, they would perish immediately. We only survive because we have communal intelligence, because we can face the much more powerful, world of animals out there, because we think in terms of herds, and we jointly survive. So that I think this text is good, but it gets at it in a very dense way. And I would like a more simplistic just explanation of it. But those were just my thoughts about why should our bodies end at the skin? Why should our bodies end with rational thoughts? It's so reductionist and false.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Ansu. And I agree with you. I think what's hard about this text is the way it is so theoretically entrenched. And even though there's kernels that she's getting at that I really enjoy, it's hard to get to. Next week, the text that we're reading, that's a chapter out of this book, is about soil, and it feels a lot less theoretical and more materially grounded, literally in the soil and the time scales of worms and bacteria breakdown. And it's a lot more along the lines of Anna Singh and Donna Haraway. And something that you were saying about an ontology, which I put the definition in the chat, it's just basically the study of being, the philosophical branch of ontology. I was thinking about the quote that relations pre-exist the self, and how that idea right there, that relations come before the individual always, like a clear, like not chicken and egg situation, but the relations come before the self. The way that that framework of thinking shifts so much, and how the commons, if we're going to try to think about the commons in terms of language, which is always limited, putting the relations before the self is already a step towards thinking in the commons and thinking with the commons. And so although this theoretical language is like really exhausting sometimes, you get at things like that can kind of help you understand the commons a little bit more, where it's not just about, or at least constructing language about the commons, which is really hard. But yeah, it's not, no, the way that relating is important to talk about with the commons and how we relate to each other changes. And maybe we start with theoretical discussion, but then it actually can take us somewhere really different and not theoretical at all about simple relations, or the other way around. I usually prefer the other way around, but
Izzy, what is the quote that you started with? Relating predates knowledge. What was the exact quote?
beings do not pre-exist their relations.
That's right.
Thank you, Izzy, for this reading, and Kavi also for this reading. I ended up spending most of the time listening while caring for my dogs. So we were in the shower. I was washing the beach sand off of them, listening to the history of dogs and human caring. So that was a funny, synchronistic kind of moment. And I really think that this subject of caring and learning is a wonderful bridge for how the imagination builds bridges with the unseen world. So the idea that we can care for the mycelium, or the mycelium plant root system that we can't see, comes from sometimes tending to these things until something springs forth that we can see and then relate to it. But the idea that the act of caring, which is like tending, is given a kind of intellectual uplift by a theorist, I think is pretty radical idea. And I really, even though I struggle sometimes with putting all of the ideas together in a kind of linear way, I find that advancing the idea of caring to a kind of proposition about learning makes me think about like also the kind of science of the way that science uplifts the intuitive knowledge that exists in our DNA about space-time continuum, for example. Like somehow, like ever since Einstein's space-time continuum, we feel like we've progressed to understand relativity, but actually people have known like in their cellular self about relativity just through the experience of, everything changing all the time. So that sense that we're constantly, as biological creatures, we're constantly changing ourselves, and finding out that we change is often in relationship to other living systems, like seeing the rate that a tree grows, or you can tell how long you've lived in a place by how big the trees have gotten, or or by the bird migrations, or how often you might see a comet. Like these ways of like tending to yourself in the world is a way that we learn. I'm not sure, I'm just sort of paddling around in the pool of ideas here, but I do think that the idea of caring involves also the idea of tending to learning. And I think that even this platform of learning on Zoom, where we're creating a platform to create an environment where we care to learn and care to share as we like relate to each other, is kind of connected to kind of the desire to continue to be, ontologically be, to exist in the world, is to kind of unfold these ideas in relationship to others.
Thank you, Lauren. I like that web of thinking that you brought us into, and what you said about what you said about relativity and trees, and like seeing a tree grow made me think about the concept of thinking with, and how like even with ourselves we're constantly thinking with ourselves, which are organisms of their own, but also organisms that are part of us and with us and in us and sometimes outside of us. When you look at a tree and observe its growth, that's also a kind of thinking with too. All these things are entangled and holding together. And so, of course, it makes sense that care is essential in that.
Wasn't one of the I downloaded now the book, but I forgot which parts of it we read. So if you don't mind putting that in the chat, because there was something in there that struck me, that caring was not something you actually did, but it's a condition. So it's necessary. You can't be or think without it. It just is.
There was a section that said that when it's necessary, it deters it from being done or being completed or acted out. I remember reading that, but let me put the selection in the chat, because I did pause on that paragraph to try to understand if she was saying if it was necessary or not. And that all relationships have care, but it's not always essential.
I was thinking more about the why should our bodies end in our skin, and kind of thinking at a very like from a very basic level in terms of like, you know, literally in terms of thinking about our skin or our, you know, layers of epidermis or shedding and recreating, and the actual boundaries of our cells is rather and it's not as concrete, especially if you're looking at it from a, you know, molecular level, looking at each of our cells of our skin, that there's barriers within that kind of overlap and create the two. So if you're, you know, touching hands with somebody, where does your skin begin and where does theirs end? Or if you're in a pool of warm water, same temperature of your, you know, same temperature as your body, where do you feel your body is at? So it kind of, you know, led me thinking more about like, if we care and we thought more about that in terms of where does our skin, where does our bodies enter our skin, you know, putting importance about we care for ourselves and put ourselves from a very individualistic perspective, you know, try to care for our bodies in the best way possible, and really thinking about ways that we, you know, from a very shellfish way of making sure we're getting the best of things. But if we thought about more about if our bodies are all connected or in ways that our consciousness are not just trapped within our bodies, and we can kind of circle or expand our circle of care and radiate or our radius of concern around us, not just, you know, be trapped with our own bodies, and thinking about more ways that I think even the way we're all kind of connected at a very molecular level with sharing so many of the same elements in our bodies from, you know, starting from the Big Bang to now, we have those same kind of common characteristics and elements, water and carbon, other things that are kind of make up and share with a lot of different beings as ourselves, and like very, very micro level that we're all kind of composed of the same things at the same time as well. Kind of rambling on with some kind of thoughts that came across my head.
I can piggyback on you, Kavi, because you know, for many years I've been doing a practice called body weather, and so the question that you ask is about this, our bodies ending in our skin, is kind of the premise for our practice, which is so you know, with the text being difficult, I tuned in to, you know, followed as much as I could, but there were a lot of things that I could relate to. But
it what really became clear to me was that that process of touching another body, of touching another being, even let's say massaging another person, it does kind of talk to that sense of care as being a state, because in order to touch another being, you do begin to exercise that sympathetic muscle. For example, that feeling of somebody crying and you immediately need to cry, or even killing an insect and feeling that sense of shared infinity with an insect. But just as a practice, just the practice of touching another being, the idea of touching a dog, that is a basic, we address all the time where our skins end in our daily life, and it can become a practice.
And Roxanne, that's a very mammalian thing as well. It's our way of connecting. It's because we don't just use our conceptual minds to relate to other people. We have to have touch and smell, and mothers do it to babies, and that's how it generates like brain patterns in babies, which affect the mother's own brain patterns. It's a whole process of cognition coming into being through the touch. And that's really powerful to think about as a mammalian.
Yes, I really related to what you were saying, Ansu, before, and yeah, thank you for making that connection. It's essential.
Well, also the word care, the idea of care, calls up the idea of attention, paying attention to something, to even know what's needed, what would be caring for a person or a place or an animal, and what is not caring for them. And here's where I shall paddle around in the pool, that maybe this idea of giving attention is affecting the experiment, the same way that if you see the lights go through the slit, the photons go through the slit, and if you're observing it, it'll be a particle, and if you're not, it's a wave. That something like that if we are paying attention, it changes the actual chemistry or experience of what's going on. And it seems like a lot of the readings have been pointing towards consciousness as a certain kind of, as an essential element to what the next steps are going to be for us all.
Oh, well, and I really love that. And I think it also, I also see that coming through with also Emily's sound and sound that she guides us through every week, and the way that it kind of orients the way that Emily carefully thinks about the text experience, the listening experience, to that kind of heightens the consciousness of it even more, at least for me. And actually, it looks like Emily's set up now and ready to go. Are you ready to go heighten our consciousness, to elevate our brainwaves? Cool. Okay. So then let's get the sound started. Thank you, Emily. That was really beautiful. And thank you everyone for coming tonight and participating. As I said, next week we'll be reading about soil. It's a little bit less theoretical than this week. So if this week was a little tiring, next week will be a bit more fun, but thank you for putting the care in, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week.
For whatever it's worth, for me, the vocabulary was fun to see what she did academically with the vocabulary was how to say that. It relates to what Lauren was saying earlier, but to bring care into the academy and to do what she did with it was quite a feat. Good night, everybody. Thank you. Great to be with you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody. That was wonderful. Thank you. Bye.
Good night.
All of a sudden, I can't remember how to get out of here. How do I leave the Zoom?